one of the many things that constantly surprises and delights us about those ancient Stoics is the extent to which they seem to be talking to the modern mind. So much so that it's almost as if there is something strange about how prescient they are about our world. What we really need to learn from that is that the world of the ancient Romans and the world of the ancient Greeks, places where these ideas come from, were not such different worlds than our own. They might have had different technologies and different politics, all sorts of different ways of doing things, but fundamentally they were the same people that we are now. And in terms of their psychology, the way they interacted with other people, they really were just doing the same things that we do using different technologies. So that's the reason why we can really look back on them and see so much validity in what they say. One of the most commonly believed differences between ourselves and ancient people is that we know more. So certainly we might know more about those technologies that I've mentioned, or we might know more about certain specific sciences that we've investigated more. Maybe we have more facts about our objective universe. Maybe. But do we really know more about ourselves? We so easily reject wisdom that has gone before us. Now, I'm not suggesting that ancient wisdom is more knowledgeable than modern wisdom. All that we are looking at, all that I'm suggesting, following our teachers, the Stoics, is that we tend to have very fixed ideas and preconceptions about ourselves, our lives, and what has gone before. I mean, we've got great preconceptions about ancient people, with them being more naive and more superstitious and all of those things than we are. And what I'm suggesting is that, firstly, they probably weren't, and secondly, it's our fixed ideas, say, about them, that create fixed ideas about ourselves. We might believe ourselves to be superior or better or more knowledgeable or more advanced than people were. Maybe we are and maybe we aren't, but it's those fixed ideas, thinking that we are, that creates the problem. What's the real problem? The real problem is that preconceptions and fixed impressions cause so much of the difficulties in our lives. So tonight I want to talk about how we can identify that, according to the Stoics, and what we can do to try and break out of that rather useless way of thinking. The Stoic teacher Epictetus tells us that your first task, the first task of anyone who wants to learn anything, is to put aside assumptions and presumptions. Because obviously it is impossible to learn what you think you already know. It's impossible to learn when you think that you already know. And it's easy, because of how we play with words, to get into a situation where you think you know, so you're defending that. Classical example that Epictetus gives us is to do with Plato. Plato defines good and defines just and defines a lot of these idealized states in order to explain perhaps what they really are and how we really need to achieve them or work towards them. But in fact, Plato was criticized for defining good and defining just, for example, as if nobody knew what those were. And it's easy for us to fall into that idea of, well, as if nobody knew what they were. But in fact, a lot of what we know and we think we know are in fact preconceptions. So when I say good or bad, we generally think we know what is good and what is bad. Sure, we might be able to understand or admit that our ideas of good and bad might be influenced by something else. For example, our upbringing and our culture. That whole morality that is given to us as we grow up and that we begin to understand. So that when you think about what you know of as good or bad, it's not only what you've been told, but it kind of feels to you that it's a truth. You are sure enough of it, generally speaking, that you can feel it as a truth. You know that is good, and you know that is bad. It's not just because your parents told you that. Obviously, there must be something subjective about that. Perhaps an example that we can more readily understand is really open to interpretation, is if I say healthy or unhealthy. What is healthy and what is unhealthy? Most people have a clear idea about what is healthy and what is unhealthy, and might be consciously following a particular philosophy of health or particular school, but in taking on the authority of others, they feel now that they know and something is defined for them. So that brings up a second matter identified by Epictetus, and that is we also hold on to knowledge that comes from outside of ourselves, that comes from an external authority. So he's not automatically saying that external authorities are wrong, but he is saying that we tend to look outside of ourselves for a reason or a justification or anything to define for us what is healthy or unhealthy or good or bad or whatever the case may be. It is an interesting thought when you think about some of your ideas and ask yourself, where do they come from? And when you examine closely how subjective they really are. For example, let's get back to the idea of what is good and what is bad. If I say wealth, some people think that wealth is good, and some people think that wealth is bad. I could do the same for pleasure. It could be good, it could be bad. Some might say it depends on the context, some might say it's always one or the other. If you look at yourself and ask yourself, where does that idea come from? Well, you'll have to probably accept that it doesn't come from you, but you might still be willing to say that wherever that came from is a greater authority than you and is therefore right. But certainly it's clear that there isn't one good or bad any more than there's one healthy or unhealthy. We could have exactly the same discussion about that, and someone might assert that a particular, say, food is healthy, while someone else might assert that it's unhealthy. And it can go deeper than asserting. It can be such a deep cultural assumption that when we look at another culture, someone from another culture, we're absolutely astonished that someone could even think that that food is healthy. That, obviously they either haven't reached the point that we have, they haven't reached the amount of knowledge that we have, or there's some deficiency because we believe we're right. Now, this discussion isn't about we believe we're right. It's simply about how holding on to such a belief creates preconceptions that lead to conflict. Epictetus's main point is in fact why I started off by saying the ancients seem to be talking about our world, because Epictetus says that is the reason for why you all fight on Facebook. So he doesn't mention Facebook, and he might not say it exactly that way, but his point is that the primary reason for conflict amongst individuals is because we all hold onto our preconceptions, and we come into disagreement with each other and we criticize each other based on those preconceptions. Clearly, the question that Epictetus is always asking us to ask is, examine your preconceptions. Ask yourself where that comes from. Why are you so sure you're right? Where does that sense of that authority come from? And how is it that someone else can be equally convinced of the opposite opinion? At the very least, I think old Epictetus is trying to discharge some of our Facebook fights by saying, Well, you're both right as much as you're both wrong. So why are you fighting? What Epictetus asserts about that is also really worth some thought, because he says, so then why are you so frustrated in that fight? Why do you get so angry? Why are you so determined that you are right? He says, if this wasn't a preconception, if this was authentic knowledge, as if there was some abstract truth, if this were some abstract truth, then you wouldn't have to feel so passionate and angry in the defense of it. Epictetus says, if you were applying your ideas properly, your preconceptions properly, why would you be so frustrated and troubled by conflict? Doesn't that mean maybe that perhaps there's something that you have to hide or defend about what you know? There's some weakness in what you know. A fascinating idea when you next find yourself in that argument. Epictetus is saying the only reason you defend it so hard is because there is a weakness in it. If it were a truth, it would be able to stand on its own. Now, that would be ideal for many truths. Now, that would be great if it didn't, if somehow truths were so self-evident that everyone said, oh, okay, that's true, and no one has to fight about it. But his point still remains about you, not about what is really the truth, but about the fact that in holding onto it in that way, you are creating a preconception for yourself. In fact, if there isn't such a thing as an absolutely abstract truth, we need to create these preconceptions in order to create our reality for ourselves. What we believe to be true is part of how we construct reality, and that's why we're defending it so strongly. That's why we're willing to fight, because if the other person turns out to be right, not only are we wrong, but our reality crumbles, or some part of our reality crumbles. So that's where Epictetus says to us, if you actually knew how to apply your preconceptions, and if there weren't such preconceptions, your reality wouldn't be so threatened by some alternative view. Because, as we know from wealth, from pleasure, from good and bad, there isn't an idealized abstract answer as to which one is true. So the Stoics suggest that we create all these reactions and impressions and responses to the world, which are really based on ourselves, on our insecurities, on our preconceptions, on our beliefs, on what influences us, and so on. And then we create a reality out of that, and we defend that reality. And that is the reason why we engage in conflict and why we end up unhappy. One of the ways Epictetus suggests that we inquire of ourselves to find out the source of that preconception and impression is to ask yourself, why do you actually want that? Say it's a desire. Why do you desire that? Is it something for you in particular, or is it just because you believe that that's a good thing, or you're told that that's a good thing? Or look at what you're trying to avoid. Are you avoiding something that's inevitable? Because in reality, the power to do what we want and the power to get what we want doesn't come from outside of ourselves. It doesn't come from other people. And it doesn't come from changing anything in the world. Because mostly you can't, and even when you can, it's still going to end up changing to something else, or doing something on its own. Remember, the most core Stoic idea is only be concerned about those things you are in control of. And of course, we're not in control of the world out there. So the result is that we have fixed ideas about what we want or what's good for us, especially because we get told. Epictetus says, you need to ask, does that apply to you in particular, or are you just following some general truth and believing that it applies to you? If you're told that you should want something, does that apply to you? Is it you who needs that thing, or is that a general idea that that would be a good thing to have? There's a big difference, and because you're not checking, is it me, and does this actually apply to me, is similarly how we wrest this power to know what's good for us and to give us what's good for us outside of ourselves. And in fact, we end up wanting what's not possible. If you ensure that what you want is possible, says old Epictetus, and that it doesn't depend on someone else, you're never going to end up in the situation of being disappointed. He's not saying, want less, don't want things that you cannot have, or some moral philosophy like that. He's just saying, check the reality against you. Is it something that is what you want, or that is just a good thing to have according to other people? Is it something that you can get, or that you're going to depend on something in the world changing, or someone in the world giving it to you? That's how to know what is really for you. Epictetus says part of the problem is that we constantly reinforce our bad ideas. We reinforce our habits, and we reinforce our beliefs. But, for example, when we lose our temper, it's not just whatever's going on now, but it's how we do things. So this is how I respond when that kind of stuff happens. And by losing my temper, I then reinforce the bad habit. It's a little bit like adding fuel to the fire. So each time we respond, or we're safe and fixed in our responses, whenever we have preconceived ideas about how things are and therefore how we should respond to them, we end up reinforcing habits and reinforcing bad habits while narrowing the possibility of alternative, often better responses to things. So much of our preconceptions and our bad experiences then are actually related to this bad pattern that we create for ourselves and that we reinforce for ourselves. We hear this nowadays sometimes, but Epictetus knew a couple of thousand years ago that we can create new habits. We need to create new habits. And so Epictetus says, for example, there are 2 steps to that, taking anger as an example. The one step is to try and not get angry in the first place. Try and not respond with anger. And step number 2 is to replace the angry response with a different behavior that could also become a habit. So today we do know about replacing habits. We know that it's not easy, but we don't often apply it to things like anger or conflict or frustration. We assume habits are things like, bad behaviors like smoking or biting your nails. But habits can also be preconceptions and predefined old ways of reacting to the same old things. That is what we can change. By learning to change our habits, by creating new ones, we can also learn to break down old preconceptions exactly the same way. So it's changing the response in 2 steps. On the one hand, don't respond the old way, and on the other hand, find a new way to respond that perhaps you can change, you can create a new habit out of. Because ultimately, as long as you don't change anything, the same old story is going to play itself out. And if you keep on thinking, I wish these people wouldn't keep on making me angry, you're at the victim of that. Whereas instead, if you decided, instead I'm going to not respond by being angry, suddenly you've changed all of those experiences in the future. That's quite powerful. You actually have the power to change those bad experiences that keep on happening to you, because one of the reasons they keep on happening to you is because you vest their power outside of yourselves. The Stoics tell us to confront and change our fixed impressions, that we must learn how to avoid the conflicts that we keep on getting into by habitual thinking and by habitual reacting, by learning to change and confront these fixed reactions. So firstly, in a situation where there is a reaction, ask yourself, how can I use this opportunity to act virtuously, to try and be a better human being in some way? You're not trying to be grand. It's all about you. It's not even, I don't want to hurt this person. That's admirable. But the point really is, I don't want to feel this anger. I don't want to be that person. So you've got to ask yourself, how can I use this occasion to be a better human being? Even things like guilt, which we were talking about last week, doesn't have to be angry. Whenever you find that your reaction is causing grief, pain, etc. to you, is to turn it into, how can I find a way to be a better person? If you are insulted and learn to respond by calmness and not reacting, you will learn patience. So you will learn to respond with patience. You can turn anger at an insult into patience by not responding. And that's how we can kind of learn to change our reactions, our impressions and reactions. Part of the way to do it, he says, is just to pause. Pause. We would say breathe. Pause. A lot of how we react is instinct, impulse, and, as I keep saying, habit. Well, one of the things about habits is that they're largely unconscious. So if we remember to pause, we can prevent a lot of the reaction. That's good old-fashioned advice of don't react, walk around the block, walk around the room, go out the room, go back into the room. That old cliche is really based on fundamental Stoic teaching that says overcome your instincts and you can overcome your habits. And overcoming your habits teaches you to overcome your impressions. And impressions trap us in our old bad ways. Another thing that comes from the Stoic tradition is learning to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. That's a great way to not necessarily have to agree with them or have to believe them, but to simply understand why our own beliefs and impressions are not necessarily 100% right. If you can understand that why another person responds a different way, even if you think, well, that's not a good response, it prevents you getting so defensive about what you believe because you've just told yourself, well, someone else has got a different reality. And that's the core of what we're saying. Some of the greatest advice that is given by the Stoics is to try not respond much at all. Speak little, but speak well. Let silence be your goal. Don't judge and don't gossip. That alone could be a great philosophy of life. And after all, does it really matter? Does it really matter if you think you're right? Probably not, because especially it's not going to even change how the other person who you just disagreed with thought, as all those Facebook and social media fights tell you. It's very rare for anyone to change anyone else's opinion. And that illustrates the very point that Epictetus is making, is that our impressions are these narrow things that we hold onto for other reasons, and we could use the language of saying because they create our reality, our beliefs about ourselves, they kind of tell us who we are in that way. Similarly, speak little of yourself. The less you speak about yourself, the less likely you are to multiply and reinforce your own ideas, fixed habits, fixed reactions, and so on. Rather listen than speak. It's a simple way, again, to avoid getting into that. If you don't have the need to defend your own belief, you can talk about something else. And it's really a good question to ask, why do you have the need? Why does any of us have the need to defend our own belief? Is it so important? Why do we need to be right? Surely it's somehow to assert our own reality, because if we thought we were wrong, our reality crumbles. Another important principle in order to let go of preconception and let go of fixed impressions is to learn to speak without judgment. Try not to snap or say sarcastic things or something that actually cuts someone down. Usually the best response is humor, and that is a principle that Epictetus knew well, because humor, of course, it gives an altogether different perspective on whatever it is that we're both disagreeing about, and it's kind of a way of not acknowledging, hey, you know what, there's an altogether different way to look at this. And even if we don't mean it as a serious one, it proves the point that neither of our ways is the absolute truth. In order to follow any of these tips on how to master our preconceptions, we need to reflect. We need to reflect every day, especially to look at, in my day today, what were the habits? How did I do things out of habit? Where did I respond out of habit? Where did I find some time to kill out of habit? Not all habits are automatically wrong, but the point is simply to learn. A lot of how I respond and react is just a habit, and I could change it just as easily. And in fact, the thing that I'm afraid of will change, won't change. I'll still be here. I'm just thinking something differently. I'm just responding something different. Reality hasn't actually changed. I don't have to worry about my world crumbling. And so maybe what I think isn't so important after all. And the one thing that Epictetus doesn't say, in the end, what have you got to lose? I'll be back next Friday, same time. See you then.